Let's take a moment to review the three core beliefs that you have about this self. These can also be seen as the three beliefs that are holding you to the river bottom. Your first belief is that the self you feel you are is entering each moment from the previous moment. In other words, you believe that linear time exists and that you exist and persist in time. So your belief in yourself is completely bound up with your belief in linear time. Secondly, you believe that the world is structurally divided into self and not self. This specific belief leads to the activity that takes up most of your life, your attempts to establish relationships with the not self, relationships that bridge the gap in between. Thirdly, because it believes it exists in the universe and not that it is of the universe, this self is uncertain about its place in the universe, about how it belongs, or if it belongs here. So this self is always on trial deep inside about its own existential self-worth, about whether it really deserves to be here, and it spends its life trying to win this trial. Zen proposes that none of these things that are holding you to the river bottom are really there. You are not entering any moment from the past. The world is not divided into self and not self. So there is no gap. There is no basis for your trial within. Here's the thing. None of these three things that Zen is proposing can be explored or decided intellectually. You have to let go of the river bottom and go where Zen is taking you. You have to let go of your current beliefs about who you are. You cannot simultaneously think that you are arriving from the past and actually experience a self that is occurring in the present. You cannot simultaneously think that the world consists of self and not self and experience yourself as dependently arising. So as long as you believe that this two-legged volume that moves through time and enters each moment from the past is who you are, you won't get any farther in Zen. This is why my job in this part of the conversation is to pry you from the river bottom. Just a little bit. Just enough for you to think about letting go. In this module, we're going to talk about your historical self. It's much easier to stop identifying with your historical self than your emotional self. Your historical self is just a story you're telling, and you can simply stop telling the story anytime. None of us really believe that our historical self is who we are. We feel halfway fake every time we tell some version of this story at cocktail parties or job interviews. The actual facts of this story are completely modular. We switch them in and out according to who we are telling it to. Our historical self is a work in progress, a story that we constantly edit and perfect. Now here's what I want you to think about. In order for this historical self to exist in your mind at all, this you that has moved through time, you need to mentally represent it. You need to mentally represent a self that has moved through time, and then you need to identify this mental representation as being yourself. So this part of your identity has two parts: the stick figure that you create, and your decision that this stick figure is who you are. In this mental representation that you are generating, the self that is moving through time is completely Cartesian. That is, the me that you imagine moving through time is the two-legged image of yourself, the Cartesian volume that contains you inside. In the story you are telling yourself, this image is also completely Cartesian. At each point along the arc of time, this two-legged volume is always somewhere and doing something in the world. So, at various points in time, this two-legged volume graduated from high school, got a university degree, moved to Los Angeles, and so on. These major points forming the arc of time that this Cartesian self has traveled can be infinitely subdivided. You drove out to LA in June, but stopped over at a friend's house in Flagstaff, and that was the first time you saw the Grand Canyon. Each of these points along the line of your historical self is defined by the two-legged volume being at a specific location in Cartesian space at a specific point in time. So, by representing a self in various three-dimensional Cartesian arrangements of world, and then linking these spatial representations together along a line, we generate a spatialized version of time that we call the past, one that seems to contain where we have been. So having spatialized time into a mental container in order to represent it, we are sure that time is something we have traveled through. Remember our earlier conversation about how we spatialize time. Time itself does not have spatial dimensions. The meal you had last night is not to the left or to the right of the coffee you brewed this morning. It's only when you represent these events in a spatialized mental image that time seems to have a spatial dimension. And that's exactly what has happened here with your stick figure that has traveled through time, just on a far larger scale. You have spatialized each point in time by imagining it as a Cartesian arrangement of world, a stick figure in Flagstaff, a stick figure in LA, and then you have stacked these three-dimensional Cartesian slices laterally and formed a seamless container that you call the past. This is clearly where the stick figure is arriving from, but this is all in your head. In reality, the time that you were in Flagstaff is not to the left or the right or behind or in any other spatial arrangement with the time that you were in LA. Time doesn't work that way. It has no spatial dimensions. I want you to notice something else. This mental representation that you've created, this self that moves in a clear line through spatialized time and arrives in the present, does not contain your emotional self. As we will talk about in the next module, your emotional self does not exist in or move through Cartesian space. Your emotional self is not a thing that travels in a direct line through Cartesian space from graduation to Grand Canyon to LA. So it is not a part of this historical self that we assemble and send through time. And this is why, when we describe who we are at job interviews or parties, the historical self that we put forward feels a bit false. We are pretending that the two-legged volume that has moved through time is who we are, but it's just a mental representation. It's a story that we've assembled. It is all entirely made up, this historical me, both the two-legged volume and the spatialized container it has traveled through. But we butt this whole mental arrangement directly up against the present moment and pretend it's spitting us out.